You're listening to the Topco Business Unusual podcast. Now, the Business Unusual podcast. Learn from the greatest minds in business today. Interviews hosted by Ralf Fletcher. Learn how to improve business, get tips from industry leaders, and be motivated by real-life experience. Topco Business Unusual.
So welcome to this week's edition of the Business Unusual podcast. And this week we've got David Renwick, who's the head of investment banking for Absa Bank, joining us. Welcome, David. Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Ralf. Great to be here, and I look forward to the discussion. I'm sure it's going to be a good one.
So, I mean, we spoke a couple of months ago, and you spoke on the Future of Sustainability Summit, and you introduced sort of some of the amazing things that Absa is doing. And as head of investing, I think I'm really interested to see where all the money's at and where you hide it and how I can get to it. But I think more than that, tell us a little bit about you and your career, and how did you get to this place of being head of investing? You're obviously very clever.
No, I wouldn't say that. I think I've always had a passion to see how economies and economics kind of help shape society, and the positive force they can do, but also the negative force. And so within the investment banking area, as much as there's some things which traditionally people have thought, do they really contribute enough to society, and is it just taking advantage of financial engineering? I thought we really need to try shift that narrative and also take advantage of the opportunity of actually being a force for actual tangible change, within the markets which we operate across Africa. And I've always been quite passionate about it, and the fact that there is this rising tide globally around kind of ESG and sustainability is just fantastic for me personally.
Yeah, I'm like a bit of a tree hugger. I'm a surfer, and we do the mountain biking, exteriors, and that sort of stuff. So also close to nature. I live by the beach. But I mean, have you always had this affinity with nature and sustainability and sort of banking, or did it start young or recently?
Look, I think my interest in banking has been there for as long as I can remember. There were periods personally in my career where I was struggling within the banking world, where kind of the impact I was potentially making felt like more impact on spreadsheets and financial reports than actually on environments and society. So again, I suppose I've mentioned it already. This is a fantastic theme because I think it can bring together, those two themes which occupy my mind, and actually be, a key part of my day job.
Yeah, and I think that there's this sense with ESG and investing, certainly that on all the elements, the environment, the social, and the governance, that we can generally solve them. But what I've seen, and certainly what came up at the conference, was that it's a trade-off. And quite often you might be able to solve two of the things, but maybe not the third. And the example is often in the mining, where in terms of the environment, we want to resolve some of the environmental issues from mining. But actually that has a massive impact on the society that those mines work in.
Look, I think that's right. I suppose I'm always nervous to hit the trade-offs too quickly in these discussions, because actually there is, for me, it all comes down to a key theme in any big project or any big initiative, is for me that connection between business, society, and government. And actually, if you bring those three parties to the table quite quickly, I think the trade-offs you deal with very quickly. The challenge which we have in some of these big projects, or some of the themes around renewable energy, as we think about in South Africa, you may have had perhaps government leading, business following, society catching up, or the other way around in some respects, business leading now. If you think about kind of the power crisis and the pressure or the work they've done with government to try enable this whole concept of captive power, but have they brought society to the table quick enough? So I think I mean, it's quite a philosophical point, but I think you need to try bring those three big clusters together early, and then I think you deal the trade-offs quickly, and it doesn't, and then it creates for something which is far more sustainable in the long run.
Is it that we, all good things come from from big challenges? Is it that there's not enough common interest, that things aren't bad enough, or have they reached that point where we can have these discussions? What's missing?
Look, I think, I suppose it's trying to split up what is kind of sustainability or impact investing, right? But I think if you look at some of the themes which there, the crisis is there, right?
Yeah.
The power crisis in South Africa is there. The CO2 emissions are there. The impact it's having on society and health in areas like Mpumalanga are there. But of course, the risk to sustainable jobs in Mpumalanga, if there's a big shift in renewable energy from Mpumalanga to the Northern Cape, is a real risk. So I think the, if I call it, the crisis is there, the burning platform is there. It's how do we now kind of rapidly pull together and actually start to debate, as you said, some of the trade-offs. But I don't think they should block us in actually trying to drive some of the real opportunity that sits in front of us.
And is it just that we got a bit of a silo mentality in terms of social groups, government groups, and business groups are not talking enough? Is it that we need to create more platforms, or is it there's too much talk and not enough action?
I think it's possibly the latter. I always talk about this fact that there is this global wall of capital that wants to be deployed on sustainable projects, right? And it's there, right? But it doesn't mean it's always going to be there. If you look at 10, 15 years ago, you didn't see ESG linked kind of unit trust or mutual funds, right? Now you see them all over the place. And so what I do worry about when there's so much talk is that we're not taking advantage of the capital which is out there, because it may not always be there. So for me, we need to create that paranoia. There's capital to invest in sustainable projects, whether they are of a societal impact or renewable energy or combination of the two. While we're talking, that money's going elsewhere, right? We chatted a little bit earlier around, potentially what's happening in Latin America and where capital is flowing. So this capital globally is also quite fungible. So SA we need to drive kind of less talk, more action. Let's get more access to the capital. And some of the things which have come out of COP27 seem to be quite positive, although I don't necessarily want to have a big debate around it because there's a lot there. But there does seem to be some signs of some good capital commitment, which is positive, right? Let's stop talking. Let's get the capital. Let's get the projects. Let's deploy it. Because as I said, it may not be there forever. Yeah,
I mean, I suppose we're talking a lot about Uruguay and how they have, over a period, in a sort of worse position than South Africa in many ways. They have got a reliable power source, but they had a long-term view because they knew investing in sustainable solutions was even more difficult then, and they weren't getting any support, so they had to almost reinvest in themselves, and it took the action of everybody. And I think their thinking was two parts, which was like, we're going to own this asset, government, but entrepreneurs, you'll have a source of someone buying it from you, which is very similar to South Africa. So it seems that we do have some successes. It's now just amplifying it and accelerating it.
I think that's right. If I think about the initial renewable energy projects linked to government, how successful they are, the various different rounds. Now we're seeing this whole captive power initiative where businesses are stepping up. And look, again, there's one aspect which is, how do we protect the environment and make it more green? But the reality is a lot of this investment going on by big business is really to keep the factories running, right? To keep the mines going. But so what? Right, let's take advantage of that. But I think there's a rapid escalation, which I think is exciting. So I think government is coming to the party. One can always say, do they come to the party quick enough? But I think that there's a real opportunity for change. It's how quickly we can deliver that shift in power source, while we have many other challenges within the state utility being Eskom.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we spoke in certainly my address at the conference. One of the things that I saw from John Doerr's book, Fast and Scale, was the 4 principles that he said to really accelerate sustainability, we need to get close to policymakers and change policies. And I thought about that, and I thought, how often do we speak to policymakers, and how much are we influencing them from business perspective? The next thing he said is moving talk to action, which we've spoken about. The third thing is investing in entrepreneurs and innovations. And is that enough being done in terms of that, in terms of investing in the education of driving these entrepreneurs and growing them?
Look, again, through a South African lens, I think we have a long history of many successful entrepreneurs, creating very big businesses and businesses of scale. Look, I think that the challenge is always how do the SMEs or the very small businesses access capital? And I think that there's a lot of progress there, but I think there's also room to move or to accelerate. If you look at other more established markets around the world, the access to kind of angel investors and venture capital is far more prevalent than it is in a market like ourselves. But again, I do see positives in that light. I did want to go back to one of the points, if you don't mind, is when you're talking about those 3 points, is this government policy and government certainty. And I'm a firm believer of that. I actually think that is more powerful than the role of banks and financial institutions in sustainability, right? The banks and the finance system comes in after policy certainty and government regulation. Banks they can influence where capital gets allocated, they can drive access to capital, but the first principle and the most powerful levers to bring about change is actually government policy.
And is that because, as you're speaking, I'm thinking to myself, is that because of the contract, the certainty in terms of the contract? Because then the finances know either who owns it, who doesn't, and how the mechanisms or the incentives will work. So then they can work out, okay, this is a longer term investment or a shorter term investment, or we might need to get these instruments ready.
Yeah, but I think that there's 2 aspects to it. One is, what is the policy today or the law today? And that allows for investment decision making, right? And so that's very important. The more that is proactive in terms of facilitating public-private participation, the more you will get access to capital and the more decisions you will make today. The next aspect is the longevity of those policies and those laws. So what people worry about, and it's across many emerging markets, okay, so those are the laws today, but what are the laws tomorrow? And so the more governments can map out plans based on track record, deliver into those plans and those policies, the more over time you're going to get more access to capital.
For sure. And do you think they're struggling because of because of the changes that are happening? We've seen that with COVID, where things have been disrupted. Or is it things like digital transformation, where you're having organizations like Uber, and so they're struggling to anticipate how digital is going to influence things? Or is it more of a social impact perspective and a policy around electing leaders?
I think there's just too many issues on the table. Right, and so the complexity when you're trying to deal with deep social challenges. We're trying to deal with a healthcare system which needs to change to provide a fair service and offering to everyone. We've got an education system that's also gone through a significant change. There are so many challenges that I worry that there's just too much noise that prevents faster decision making. But at the same time, there is decision making happening. So I think we also got to again step back and say the positives. If we roll back the clock 5 or 10 years, if you and I were having a discussion and said, would there be the level of commitment from the private sector and institutions in terms of tangible renewable energy projects that are happening? I think we would have said, no, not sure.
Yeah.
So
And
I
it's
think
true.
there's a very big positive shift here.
And I think that's true in terms of labor and labor relations, those sorts of things as well. And I think one of the things that we saw a big shift was people's perceptions and trust. And traditionally, there was more trust in terms of like the media in content or government, and there's a massive shift during COVID to the trust being more around organizations and big business and transparency. So I think there has already been a big shift. They've seen businesses doing the right thing for society. Certainly in COVID, the majority of businesses.
Yeah, I think that's right. If I think about the number of entities we dealt with, and we changed our business almost overnight to what we called from the offensive to the defensive. So in other words, everyone, a lot of our business is around kind of sales, marketing, the new idea, which is a very offensive initiative, to that of defensive. So in other words, how do we make sure the businesses and the corporates which we deal with, how do we make sure they survive? And how do we make sure and it's interesting in the dialogues with many of the big and mid-sized and small corporates in South Africa, they really adopted that same mentality. And if I think about as we said, in various risk committees, and we were looking forward, and we were just seeing kind of doom and gloom, right? But actually that bond between kind of business, society, and the financial services actually was very strong, that a lot of that doom and gloom actually never materialized. If I think about the level of large scale bankruptcies or liquidations, and there are some businesses that have really struggled to come out of the pandemic, but far fewer than we thought. Yeah, and I think it is a function of that, the attitude and the behaviors of kind of those key constituencies.
Yeah, and almost I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of, we're seeing it also in the mining industry as well. And there's this I think this old perception that industrialized organizations, banks, and big corporates were abusive in terms of employees and productivity, but we're seeing a massive shift now. And the role of organizations like organized labor, trade unions, they're really struggling to adapt, because employers are looking at talent in a completely different way as possibly they did before. They're really diving in. And so from a social impact, we're seeing businesses having far more impact now.
Yeah, I think that's right. What we also mustn't lose sight of, though, is a big challenge we have in this country is unemployment, but B, those people that are employed, are they actually achieving a living wage?
Yeah.
And with their take home, can they actually support a family, or are they visiting kind of payday lenders, or have debts that are through the roof just to actually survive? So in other words, they're not creating liabilities or debt, for luxury goods. They're creating it, for school fees and school books and food on the table. So, so I agree with you. I think there is a lot of positives, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that even a big portion of the employed community, never mind the unemployed, are struggling with actually a living wage.
And that's probably something that business as a whole can be proactive about. Instead of waiting for the government to change legislation and to bring about things, we can be proactive. And I think we've been proactive in so many other ways. This is something that we need to put on our agenda.
Yeah, I agree.
And so we spoke earlier about sustainability and some of the challenges with sustainability. And then we talked around the rise and fall of nations and the impact of education. And it's quite relevant, because we have the Oracle of Omaha, the number one investor in the world, Warren Buffett. And I've watched many of his sort of videos. And one of the things I showed my children from probably, 20, 30 years ago, when he spoke at one of the universities, was the best investment that he's ever made, or that you can ever make as an individual, is in yourself.
Yeah. Okay, that's it.
And so
go for it. Sorry.
Yeah, and so how does education, and how important is that to our sustainable future?
Look, I think it's it's exceptionally important. But again, there's lots of exceptionally important things, right? Food on the table at the end of every month, getting basic healthcare, getting an environment which has a reduced level of crime, and there is punishment for crimes committed. So I always, you got to balance these things. But I fully agree with you, and I do think the role of education and the importance of education in the South African and the African context is not at the forefront of where it should be at the moment. I do think there is some quite big challenges in our education system. We all see the same reports around kind of the levels of maths and science capabilities that are coming through our education system. And for me personally, it's a real worry, because those are the people that we need to run businesses in 5, 10, 15 years time. And look, it's not a new concept, but I do think amongst all the challenges which we have, the need to elevate the concerns which are through our education system need to come to the fore a lot quicker, and we need to see more change there. And at the same time, I do think that if there is a pocket that can create this awareness, again, I think it's the solutions there are solvable, right? How do you change the education system to make it more inclusive of a higher standard? How do you possibly bring in the private sector to help? How do you bring in foreign investors into the education system? There's many examples around the world where this has happened. I think, again, I think this is one which is in our control. This is not driven by commodity prices or kind of inflation. This is something which I actually think we can tackle, and we do need to tackle.
Yeah, and so I suppose it's the we know we need to. It's the how. How are we going to come together as a grouping, as a priority almost? It seems like we almost need these priority sort of initiatives to be driven by everybody. Do you think business is doing enough to drive these initiatives?
I think they could do more. If I think about how rapidly if we just take the power sector has evolved, where I think government and business, and we need to bring society in there a lot quicker, have come together to try to solve some of these challenges.
Yeah.
I think the same could happen in education.
Yeah.
There are many pockets of private education that I think could be supersized. Could you outsource? How do we bring a whole lot more expertise to the table a lot quicker? And I think the private sector can assist. I don't think the dialogue between government, which is by far the biggest provider of education in this country, people often think that it's kind of the private schooling system, but it's really not. It is I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but it's a very small portion of the number of children that get educated are in the private sector. But there is a whole lot of, a bit like renewable energy, there is a lot of capital out there that is very keen to support education.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, we have different award programs, and what we saw was the investment not necessarily in students and not even necessarily in teachers, but the best investment with the biggest results in terms of pass rates, literacy, is around the leaders of the schools, where there were some schools with 0% pass rates in matric, and it went up on average to 14% in the worst performing schools in this country, just with coaching and mentorship of the leaders. So there are some things we know work. How do we get business to help more then?
Look, I think that topic is not just in business. I mean, that's not just in schools. That's in business. That's in hospitals. You have the right person at the top, and everything flows down quickly. So I think it's how do we more create more of awareness, and how do we try then pull business and government together to try solve these needs. And there are. I'm not that close to it, but I am aware that there is a positive dialogue. So I'm not in any way saying this is a hostile position. I think it's how do we actually come together, increase that thoughtfulness, and and try to actually find some solutions, like we've seen, as I said, in the power sector.
Great. So, I mean, look, ABSA's a traditionally South African bank, been going for 150 years. You're doing some amazing things. I think there's a bit, the Africanacity sort of advertising was really, really, I suppose, infectious for a lot of people and related. And I see that you've got a big growth drive towards Africa now, and Africa as a continent, and creating those possibilities to come to life. What are some of the investments that you're looking at within Africa? I mean, what's exciting you in Africa?
I think there are a number of things. There is if you look at some of the bigger trends across the continent, you're seeing gradually, despite the pandemic, but despite some of the big challenges this year around inflation, you're seeing this overall movement of communities kind of closer together. You're seeing GDP per capita increasing, and you're seeing a huge group of people that have a desire to grow personally through education, through creating businesses, through creating employment. And that is very exciting. South Africa, we see lots of opportunities, but we see equal opportunities in many of the other markets, and there are common themes. And we think that there is great opportunity at a very domestic level, but then there's also very big opportunities at kind of a global level. There's many people that see the opportunity like we see it, and wanting to invest across the continent, through our offices, which we have in many jurisdictions. There is always opportunities of people that want to invest in these same ideas. So we think it's a very exciting growth opportunity, in addition to what we want to continue to do, within South Africa. Post the separation from Barclays, we see ourselves as truly a Pan-Africa bank, and we want to live up to that aspiration.
For sure. I mean, it is exciting. And is that investment, are you seeing it more necessary at the moment, being in like infrastructure type projects to build that? Or do you see that we can skip some infrastructure projects, almost like the internet, and start looking at more technology type opportunities?
Look, I think it's a combination. Look, the technology opportunities are interesting, right? To build towers across the continent. You've seen some very interesting businesses that have built these kind of cell phone towers, which assist in kind of data and voice transmission. You've seen that across the continent, and that it's a little bit easier than trying to build railway lines and dual carriageway highways, right? And so some of that technology investment has happened very quickly. And if you just think about, although there's huge room to grow, if the level of internet penetration is very exciting across the continent, so access to data, and that is critical as to where you see businesses evolving quite quickly. One of the most important devices an SME has on this continent is their mobile phone. Right?
Yeah.
Because that's their bank, that's their supplier dialogue, it's everything there. So I think that is very interesting. However, some of the traditional basic infrastructure still needs to continue to be developed, right? You still need, as I said, the highways, the railway lines. You still need to continue to invest in that basic infrastructure. So there's some things you can kind of leap over. But I do think there's other things you can't, port maintenance, port improvement. You need to get goods into a country, you need to get them out, right?
The boring stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
and the high capital investments. I mean, you talk about rail, and it's really interesting because I know that Berkshire has invested in rail, and we're seeing now in France, if there's I think it's if a flight is less than 2 hours by train, they've cut the airports. I think it's starting next year. It might even be sooner.
Yeah, that's right.
And so that's a massive impact that the governments, and I think that's been driven by government.
It has been driven by government, yeah.
But those
and it's also, but look, I think there it's two things. One is reducing emissions, of course, but also it's actually use the infrastructure which you have, right? So the more you use it, the more revenue generated and the more you can kind of reinvest in that infrastructure. And I think one of the challenges in our, if we bring it back to South Africa, is I think, we need to use, there's a bit of a balance. Some of our infrastructure is really creaking, but maybe we didn't use it enough, and therefore kind of it didn't generate the revenues to kind of reinvest. And remember, infrastructure, if it's always going to be the tax man or the consumer that pays for that infrastructure, it doesn't work either.
Yeah. It was interesting. There was a study a couple of years ago where I think it was Brazil. They'd nationalized the rail system and people had to bid for the different rail systems. And a lot of it was, again, at a state where you couldn't really utilize it. And so some of the organizations actually really took a sustainability perception. So they looked at, when they bought some of the rail systems, they looked at the worst used and they would reuse some of the tracks instead of buying new tracks. And they were trying to maintain the locomotives as effectively as possible, just so that they could start making a profit, so that they can then over time reinvest in that business. And so they had a sustainability model for that nationalization of those railways. Is that what's needed, do you think? Do we need to look not just at sustainability in terms of the climate, but the resources we have, the land, the infrastructure, and not making massive overhauls with infrastructure development, but possibly how we can maintain some of the great things we have?
I think that's right. South Africa, relative to many other emerging markets, has actually a great infrastructure platform. And the base is there, right? So the foundations are there. Some of the houses are built. Some of the houses need drastic repair quite quickly. I know it's a very simple analogy, but that's how I see it, right? So I'm completely aligned with your views. Is how do we kind of not build new foundations necessarily in kind of new houses? Let's kind of fix what we have. And I do think that there is a lot of desire by both government and business to actually do it. So again, it comes back to how do we, as some of your opening comments, how do we bring it together quickly enough? Less talk, more decision, but make sure those decisions are long-term and sustainable and inclusive. And I think there's many examples where we've demonstrated that.
And I suppose that where we are as a country, we're not elections, we have a new leadership being decided in a month's time. We've come out of COVID. There was a credit adjustment, but now we're seeing S&P coming out with some very positive perceptions about South Africa. We're seeing a number of investments from the US. Has the tide changed for South Africa and Africa? Is this our time, or?
It's interesting. Has our time changed? I think one of the benefits of working in many different markets is that sometimes when you immersed in the markets, you only see the negatives, right? And you kind of get caught, and you don't see the relative value which you may have in the environment which you're in, right? And so I think South Africa has always had huge opportunity, but sometimes we get so fixated on kind of all the problems, but we don't look at it, the relative value. The infrastructure we have related to many other markets which we operate in just across the continent is tremendous, right? But we get bogged down in the narrative, well, kind of Transnet's falling over, or there's big challenges at Transnet, but we have Transnet, we have a Transnet, right? We have a fantastic platform. So that, so it's great that you see these positive signs. In some respects, my view is kind of, we've always had them. Okay. We sometimes are not looking kind of, as I said, on relative value.
So how do we dive into them more then? Is it about reflecting on the good and trying to make them better? Because there does seem to be a sense that firstly there was that everybody was leaving the country and the skills and sort of, but what I saw certainly is some of the JSE listed companies in South Africa are giving a phenomenal return on investment. So you have a lot of
Yeah.
organizations in South Africa doing exceptionally well for their shareholders and for their employers. And when they're investing, they're taking their profits and investing internationally, they're not getting the same returns. And a lot of them are coming back and reinvesting in South Africa.
I think that's right. Because look, in simple terms, they know how to make money here. Right?
Yeah.
Many of our big businesses in South Africa have operated through many challenging periods in this market, and they know how to generate, good margins. They know how to build. They know how to invest, and often they've gone into markets sometimes through acquisition. And I always caution people, kind of, if you're the foreigner and you outbidding all the local investors for an asset, have you not missed something here? And it's the same in our market, right? The best, the most capable people to understand value and opportunity are the people that live and breathe in that environment. Yeah, they should be the best people to understand value. Should not be someone who's coming in from internationally. And I think, and so that's why the SA businesses, I think a lot of them are exceptionally strong and exceptionally well run. It's people that really understand how to create value in this environment.
It's so funny.
I'm not chasing away foreign direct investment. I think it's hugely valuable, and we've seen more foreign direct investment in kind of the data centers in this country. You've seen big investment again by kind of Walmart in Massmart. So that's all very positive. So it's not a case of one good, one bad. I'm just trying to create the point that actually you were saying that we have some very well run businesses in this market.
Maybe I'll say this. It's not just well-run businesses. I think we have great leaders and great business people also in this market. And so maybe I'll help you a little bit here. When I read the Naspers book about Koos Becker, they were very strategic that when they made their best investments is where they invested in a company that had great leadership from that country. So it's not just a reflective about South Africa. It's about, we don't necessarily need to take our people and take them to other markets to invest in other countries. We can invest in other countries with other top talent. But the same here. If people are going to invest in South Africa, they should be investing in the people. They should be investing in the leadership here.
I think that's right. And as Absa, be careful, it's not an advertorial for Absa, but if I think about how we developing our businesses in various markets, the board, the chair, senior management, yes, there may be some participation from people, from the controlling shareholders or large shareholders, but it is very much local driven. We want top bank CEOs, very strong board that really understands the local environment. That's for me very critical. And I think where acquisitions go wrong, both where South African companies have bought things internationally and where kind of international companies have bought things domestically, is when they all of a sudden shuffle the decks and the people that are there really don't understand how to get things done. They may be exceptionally competent in their fields of expertise, and many of them are. But the old analogy, there's nothing like local knowledge.
So I mean, it's fascinating because you're obviously doing a lot of investment. You see a lot of trends, and so there's the analogy that you can you can take a great leader and put them into a bad company, and you'll still have a bad company. And so when you're investing in good companies, what are you seeing as those principles or those things that you're looking for from those organizations?
Look, I think there's a couple of things, right? One is there a very clear strategy and business plan, right? Does it make commercial sense? Does it have the right ability to generate sustainable margins? But again, that's kind of all desktop analysis, right? The key then is, as you say, is how do you overlay that kind of, well, the strategy makes sense, the business can generate acceptable margins, but then who the people that actually deliver on that? And if we go back to kind of the COVID example, right? It's for me, it's very interesting. There were, on paper, there were many businesses that shouldn't have survived. For sure, there are many businesses that today shouldn't, but due to the tenacity of the management and how they galvanized the entire organization so they did survive. And there's some other businesses that maybe have not fallen over yet, but are in very bad shape. That, again, on the desktop analysis, you would have said, these guys are going to bounce back. They're going to have strong margins. But without the right management, are now sitting with very weak balance sheets and are struggling for survival.
So it's so funny. So it's about the leadership, do you think, or is it about the leadership team?
It's definitely the team, right? But again, a good leader knows that, right? So I think it just naturally happens, right? A good center forward might not know that, but a good leader does.
Okay, we won't get into football here. So I suppose the next sort of insight is that, we spoke about earlier, growing this economy. How do we help fund and grow SMEs? And for many, I suppose, fintechs, fast growth companies, there's this appetite to need a runway to grow. But for a lot of traditional SMEs, there's a perception of how do they get funding? I suppose that's sort of the question I'm almost leading to, is like, what can an SME be doing to make themselves attractive for investment? And is that the main thing? Is investment the main thing that you should be looking at? Or is it their network? Or is it some knowledge or skill or some insight? What are your thoughts there?
Look, I think whether it's a big business or a small business, I think those same basic principles apply, right? Is there a very clear strategy? Does the business plan link into that strategy? And do you have the right people? I think and so you have many SMEs that have those key components. I think the last factor, of course, which many big businesses take for granted, is, do you then have the balance sheet? And I think that's where you're going, right? And I think that's where, of course, the challenge is, in environments where you don't have the same level of SME equity investors through type of angel investors or venture capital. I think that the fintech players are rapidly filling some of that void. And it's very interesting what they're doing. However, a lot of them are serving and there's two aspects to running a business well, of course. There's the balance sheet, and then there's kind of the income statement. And the fintechs are helping a lot in terms of the income statement. So in terms of how do we take a view on your debtors? So how do we discount your debtors far better than big banks can do, because we have great technology and we really understand the flows in your business. So I think so of course, they're allowing the SMEs to be far more effective in their cash flow generation, which is great. You generate cash, you generate profits, so you create equity, over time, but it's not necessarily solving often you need equity very early on. So the fintechs, I think, are playing a remarkable role. And they really are servicing an area of the market which has been a little bit neglected. However, it's not going to solve everything. You still need more in that venture capital angel investor, where you're going to see a stronger balance sheet on day one than a weaker balance sheet. If you look at many businesses which fall over early on, it's not through sometimes lack of energy, passion, commitment, strategy, business plan. It's actually just access to capital.
But I suppose it's that old saying is, all lottery winners end up poorer. So, it's not necessarily just access to capital, because if you don't have the discipline and the principles in place, getting finance in itself is one part, as all lottery winners will tell you. But, once you've got the money, it's easy to spend that.
Well, look, again, it goes back to kind of the management and the people, right? And I think that's the hard decision. And so it's easy to say, well, you need more venture capital, you need more angel investors, right? That's easy to say, right? To get people that can sit and look at small opportunities and really understand the people that are going to run the business, and to do that assessment to say, is this the person that is really going to look after the last cent or the last rand? Or is this a person that's going to say, well, I'm just going to invest now, and don't worry, I will get more equity as it comes along, right? And it's interesting because some of the fintechs over the last few years, and some of them in Africa have adopted that, right? You're seeing some of the big fallout in fintechs and tech now is that I think people are of the view that if the fintech in itself is a great idea, that there's always going to be more capital, right? But the world has changed quite a lot this year. And I think some of the fintechs, and you're seeing it in Africa, as well as you're seeing it in many places, a lot of job cutting, a lot of business rationalization, because people have realized that actually I need to create the business, which is a fintech business. I need it to show signs of getting to profitability. I need to show positive cash flows. There's not just this infinite pool of series A, B, C, D kind of fintech capital that's just going to arrive. That game is over for now.
Yeah, and so do you think that part of the strategy is not just skill, but organizations need to be looking at values then as well when they're looking at team players and people, and even investing in other organizations and working with people? Is that a big thing, do you think?
Yeah, values is very big. I think people look. I think there's, as society has evolved and evolved positively, the pure profit motive has been weakened by the fact that people want to be associated with organizations that have the right value system and generally have a positive impact in society. And so it kind of, as society has become more aware of that and wants to drive that, people say that businesses maybe, we've got great values and look what we're driving. But for me, actually, you have to have that. That is kind of your ticket to the game, right? If you don't have that, no one's going to work for you, right?
Yeah. So it's not like we've got to get it. It's like if you don't have it, you're not even coming. Like, don't bother.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And so, I mean, just closing up, we're talking to the head of investment banking for ABSA, and so it would be a pity not to ask you your own personal or business investment sort of principles of success or advice. What do you think are the principles, both personally and for a business, in terms of investing?
Yeah, look. I'm
put you on the spot here a bit.
I'm not a certified financial planner, and it would have to come with a very long narrative that anything I say is not tax advice, it's not financial advice. Look, I think with anything is it's kind of patience and commitment, right? And that's how businesses have evolved, and the strongest businesses are those that kind of have a clear plan, know that there's going to be bumps along the way, but are disciplined enough to stick to that plan, and I suppose also disciplined enough that sometimes that plan will need to shift a bit to the left, a bit to the right, but you've got to be able to stay the course. And successful businesses, across this continent, in this country and globally, are all of those that have always been run by a very disciplined kind of ethos. We've got to do things properly. We've got to do things right. We've got to be inclusive. And those that are not fall by the way. But so again, I don't think this is something which is new, right? It's something which has been around before.
But we forget it sometimes. And I think that we're in the TikTok sort of world of immediate gratification, and we're in the Bitcoin world of speculation, and in that share price analysis where we're constantly looking at performance on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. And I think we see the same thing with positive change, like you talk about transformation, diversity. Those sorts of things, change within people and organizations, takes time. And so whenever I've pushed change too quickly, it often fails, instead of trying to be that little bit. And I've tried to do it because I've tried to implement it with a bang, but it's often be having the patience, the long term.
I completely agree.
David, it was lovely having you on the podcast. We're so grateful. I think it's such an interesting conversation. I suppose that the last point is really, the Prime Minister of Barbados came to South Africa. I actually saw her speech, so I didn't watch it at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. And I suppose in many ways, it's the North versus the South. So the North has created a problem around carbon emissions, and the South in many ways has to pay for that.
Yeah.
Is that a challenge? Is that a challenge, or is it that we just must accept what happened and moved on and just invest in the things we need to invest in?
Look, as a banker, I see that as a huge opportunity. You know,
Okay.
as I said earlier, there is this wall of capital, if I can call it, from the north that wants to invest in our continent to generate renewable energy, which will hopefully generate power. And we know our power per capita is exceptionally low in this continent, right? So if we can harness, I think we should really focus on this, what is perceived to be a challenge, and create this opportunity and say, guys, okay, yeah, you were the problem, right? Now let's fix it, right? And your fixing it is significant foreign investment on the power and renewable platform on this continent to help change and help deliver some basic needs, which are still outstanding on this continent in terms of kind of power to the home. Without power to the home, you don't have access to data. You can't run your SME. Your children need to be educated through online platforms now. They need access to global connectivity. So yeah, I think there is that debate, but I think we should capitalize on it. Let's take advantage of it, because there is that capital. If we can harness that capital into good projects, we're gonna end up being the winners, not the losers here.
And so it also has an onset impact as well for jobs and for other things that it can create. So your advice is take it while it's there, and quickly.
Fully agree.
Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Rob. Okay, bye now.
Bye. Cool. Sure. There was so much that I wanted to cover, but geez, we got through a couple of them.
Thanks, Rob. I don't know. That was a good chat.
I think so. And I think the last part is like just being patient as well. I think what I see is good organizations, good countries, they have a plan and they're patient about it, but they stick to it. And I think that's what you're saying as well about the government. We need to have a plan now, and we need to stick to that plan.
Yeah.
And get everybody around. Lovely. Thank you so much.
Good. Thanks, Rob. Talk soon.
Bye.
Cheers.